ask you a question. If you were in Nehemiah's shoes, and you were thinking about going back to Jerusalem and building the walls, rebuilding the walls, this is something that had been attempted for 141 years before Nehemiah. And if you would have just thought for a moment that God was calling you, what would be your immediate response? Your immediate response would probably be much like mine. And it would be a response of being a little bit overwhelmed by the size of the project, wouldn't it? I don't know about you, but I just consider myself just an ordinary man. That's what I love about serving God, is He gets to do extraordinary things, and I get to be a part of that. But it has nothing to do with me. And I can almost imagine that Nehemiah, in thinking about this calling that had been placed on his life, and thinking about the hugeness of the task that God had called him to do, I can almost imagine that this man would be somewhat overwhelmed by this task. But he embraced it anyway. He embraced this task. He goes to Jerusalem. He inspects the walls. And he does all of this. There's this personal embracing of God's calling on this one man's life. And here's where it gets real relevant for me and you. Because as we think about our life, the thing that I want to challenge you with this morning is this. What spiritual initiative personally might God be calling you to this morning? What might God be laying out before you that you may respond and see His good work, that you may respond and see His amazing power, like Oswald Chambers talked about, this miraculous power that when we are able to arise from the dead? What is it that God may be calling you to respond to or to embrace, considering this sort of a spiritual, this personal spiritual initiative? What kind of thing might God be calling you to? In other words, a question that we might consider is this: what impossibility might God be calling you to arise to? What are those impossible situations in your life? You've got them. Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's a broken relationship that looks like it's impossible to restore. 12 years ago, I was suffering from depression. Some of you know this story. I've shared it before, but I was suffering from depression in the very worst of ways. I mean, there were literally days where I would lay on the couch and I would cry and I would sleep. And then I would wake up and I'd cry some more and I would sleep. And then I would wake up again and I would cry and I would cry and I'd cry. And then I would sleep some more all day long, crying and sleeping. I'm talking about as low as a man could get. I've been there. And I was suffering from depression. And for me personally, there was times in my life throughout the week that I would cry out to God and I'd say, God, I need you more now than I've ever needed you in my life before. And I would wait patiently for God to just come down and just rescue me from this depression. I would cry out and I'd say, God, I need you. And then there were other days where I would get sort of mad with God. And I'd say, God, if you're there, then why am I having to deal with this depression? Why am I having to go through all this pain and agony and just despair? God, if you're there, then where are you? Why have you abandoned me in all of this? And so there would be days like that. There would even be other days I'd just get kind of fed up with God. And I'd say, well, God, if that's the way you're going to be, I don't know that I need you anymore. I'm just being transparent with you. It was bad. There were all kind of emotions running through my head. And I was depressed and I was discouraged. And I came to that place in my life where I felt dead inside. Have you ever felt dead inside? Have you ever felt like, that there was just no life left in you? That's where I was at. And one day, I was spending a little time in prayer, and I don't remember what attitude I was in that day. Maybe it was into crying out to God again. And I began to cry out to God, and this is what I realized that God began to tell me. God began to reveal to me, David, I've given you all that you need. David, I'm there with you now. I'm just waiting on you, buddy. I'm just waiting on you. In other words, I began to realize that God had never abandoned me. that God had never left me, that God was not angry with me, that God cared deeply for me. I began to realize that, but I had never taken the initiative to respond to all of that. The promises that God loves me, the promises that God has never left me nor forsaken me. I'd never really responded to any of that. I had to come to a place in my life where, despite the suffering that I was experiencing in my life, I had to come to the place where I said, you know what? The suffering I don't like, but you know what, Jesus? You're enough. You're enough. God, you're all I need. And God, if suffering is what you have in store for me for the rest of my life, then okay. And you know what? There's just something about coming to a place where you initiate some sort of response to what God has already done for us that is so freeing. If you know my story, you know that it took several months before I came out of that such a low place, but God restored my relationship with Him, and He restored my relationship with my family and my friends, and I came to a place where I began to live for God rather than wallow on a couch in tears. A personal embrace of God's calling upon your life. Listen to this. Paul is writing to the Ephesians, and he's quoting Isaiah 60, verse 1, when he says these words. And I think about this as a man who is suffering from depression on a couch. Listen to these words. These are powerful words that he says. He says, therefore, he says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. Is that not a remarkable promise for us all this morning? That this is an invitation to salvation is what this is. Arise from the dead, he says. Arise as if you were dead. Look at this quote that we have again from Oswald Chambers. He says, when God sends His inspiration, it comes to us with such miraculous power that we are able to what? To arise from the dead and do the impossible. When are we as the people of God going to begin to act like the people of God and respond to that which He has called us to do? At some point, God has done everything. He's there waiting on us, and we have to be the kind of people that respond to this amazing, miraculous power that's at our disposal.